Hello, my name is Rick Baker. I am with the Registered Professional Foresters Association of British Columbia. I have with me one of my fellow co-workers, Fred Thiessen, who's also a registered professional forester. We're down here at Lakeside Park in the city of Nelson, and between Fred and I, we had mentioned several years ago that Nelson had such a variety of trees that were not necessarily native to British Columbia. We felt that we should get together and put together a small tour, particularly in Lakeside Park. Once we'd decided on this particular approach, we contacted Eric Lees, who is the city gardener, and he gave his full support to us and encouraged us with lots of enthusiasm. And so what we ended up with eventually for this particular location was we put together a map of the trees of Lakeside Park. And what we've done is identify where all of the trees are by location, identified the species, and then numbered each species in the park. And then on the reverse, we've put a short description, maybe one or two sentences, on the importance of the species to forestry or the urban environment in general, and maybe how to identify the tree and some peculiarity about the tree, like is it medicinal use or is it furniture wood or whatever. And I don't know, have you got any other comments, either Fred or Eric?
Not right now.
Well, it's been a great education for myself working with the Registered Professional Foresters Association, and I think we've already dispensed 18 to 20 of these little maps, and it's obvious by the response to the maps that people are using using the maps, and it's great to see people making use of it, because there's been a lot of questions over the years as to what these trees are and where they come from, and as you say, what they've been used. And I look forward to doing more of that around the city, and it's good to be working with the association.
Yeah, we've, hopefully Eric is planning on having a small box where you can pick up these things. If you come to the greenhouse, and I guess it's the greenhouse nearest to the railway tracks, and come to the north end of the greenhouse, there should be a small box there that will eventually say, take one. Pick one of these small pamphlets up, and it's primarily a self-guided tour, and you can start right off the corner of the greenhouse and follow yourself around the park. We hope we've got enough what we call navigational features so that you can locate yourself beside a lamppost or a corner of a garden or off the change house, so that you should have a reasonably good time trying to find your way and navigate around the park with this small pamphlet. I think that maybe what we should do now is go outside and have a look at some of the species around the park, and we'll be discussing some of the merits of these species and how we've identified them. The tree we're standing under right here, just off the greenhouse, is what we have identified as an English elm. You can see from the trunk, it can grow to quite a large size. It's commonly used as a shade tree. There are several species that are common to North America, not necessarily to the West Coast, however. We identified this tree as an elm by looking at leaf shape. It has an unequal base. In other words, the basal part of the leaf. We have corky wings or protuberances on the younger twigs. And lastly, to confirm the actual, whether it was an English elm or a North American elm, we looked at what we called the seed, or a samara. And the English elm does not have a hairy samara, if I can put it that way, or a wing coat.
This is a samara here, isn't it, Rick?
That's correct. And what we were looking for on this is to see if there was any small white hairs on the samara. Yeah, and on the branches here, if you come down to the park and you look at this tree, you look at the corky wings that Eric is showing on the branch itself, and you don't have to look too far up the tree to see it. Most of these small branches are right off of the lower part of the stems. And on the unequal leaf base, I think if you hold that up against the branch here, we can look right down here where Eric is pointing. The base of the leaf is unequal. They don't join at the same point on the petiole. Did you get that?
Several of these markers.
Yes.
Here.
The next tree we come to in the park, which is quite close to the English elm, which we just looked at, is a Norway spruce. And if you really want to know and identify a spruce, just go up to the branch and grab one of the branches here, and the needles are very, very sharp. And if you are not careful, you could actually puncture your hand. The other thing you might want to do is to take a needle and try and roll it in your fingers. Most spruces, the needles are four-sided, and they will definitely roll in your finger, and you can feel it as it rolls back and forth. This tree is native to Northern Europe. It is used for lumber primarily. I would imagine it's also used for some furniture manufacturing. But it's been imported to North America and is commonly planted as an ornamental or in people's backyards, and commonly through most of the parks throughout North America.
Shall we take a walk to the Tree of Heaven?
Yes, okay, we'll move over across to what is commonly called the Tree of Heaven. And the thing to note about this tree is the very long leaves. Now, if we can pull down this branch here, what we call a leaf is from here to here. These are not leaves. These are leaflets. So when you look at this tree, you consider that whole long 2-foot piece of foliage, the leaf. And if you take a leaf or a small branch and you crush it in your fingers, and then take your fingers to your nose, you'll smell a very unpleasant odor. It's very characteristic of this tree. It's again an ornamental type tree planted for shade purposes. I don't know, I don't believe it's used too much for its wood properties.
It's very pollution tolerant, so it's a good tree to use in downtown urban areas because of its pollution tolerance. It's got a fairly open pattern to its growth, so the light coming through is filtered and not that dense shade that you'll get with a lot of shade trees. So it's quite a nice tree. It's commonly used in downtown urban planters because its root system is not that vigorous either.
Okay, next we'll move over from the Tree of Heaven to a European chestnut. This tree can be used for shade purposes, but I think more commonly it's used for its food purposes. The chestnuts are edible. I don't know if we can see any of the fruit on here just yet.
One up a little higher there than we can reach, I'm afraid.
But very characteristic of chestnuts is this leaf shape. It's what we call a dentated leaf margin. It's very, if you can look at it, it's a very characteristic leaf shape. Sort of a serrated, very deeply serrated. And here Eric has got some of the fruiting bodies here. If you look, they're very spiny, and you break that open, you'll find the chestnuts inside. And what you do is take that, break the husk, and you can roast the chestnuts in hot coals, and they're very tasty. I can testify to that. Again, I believe that this tree is commonly used as a shade tree in most urban environments. And it doesn't grow that tall. Like, it's not going to grow to any great extent, maybe 30 feet, Eric?
Oh yes, maximum 30 feet.
That's it for this tree. Here we are just off the tennis courts here, and we're at what we call a white poplar. And you can identify this tree as a poplar by, first of all, looking at what we call a long petiole, which the leaf is attached to the twig with. That's this portion right here. Also, the branching habit on these trees is what we call alternate branching. In other words, you get one branching off, and then below it on the opposite side, you get another one branching off. And the petiole itself, which is this piece here, is flattened. You can take that in your hands, and you can see that we have a bit of a flattened on that side. And then to identify it as a white poplar, we look at the underside of the leaf, and you can see that there are very fine white hairs on the underside of the leaf. Now, this tree is commonly planted as a shade tree, but it's also very tolerant of city smoke and ash, pollution, carbon monoxide from the cars. That's the reason why it's very popular with the arboriculturalists and the horticulturalists around North America.
It's not that messy a tree either, is it? Because you don't get a lot of fruit. Rarely will you see fruit on the poplar trees, so it's strictly leaves and some small twigs that you have to clean up.
So another place you'll see this if you're driving around town is along in front and beside of Hume School, and also in front of the City Tourist Park. I believe there's about a half a dozen white poplar trees. There's about 5 of these trees alongside the tennis court and the nursery if you're coming down to the park. Okay? Yeah, let's move over here to the Japanese Katsura tree. And I'm going to pass the mic to Eric. He knows a little bit more about this tree than I do.
This tree is a bit of an oddity in that the leaves, as you'll see, are quite a round, almost perfectly round shaped, and they turn a lovely orange red in the fall. Quite a coarse leaf. It may be confused with some other species, but easily identified by, again, the round shape to the leaf, slightly serrated, and the red petiole. It's we haven't used the Latin names for these trees, but it has a rather interesting Latin name, Cercidophyllum, which I kind of like the sound of. Some of these Latin names have an interesting sound to them. So this is the Cercidophyllum, or the Japanese Katsura tree, really grown pretty much entirely for its fall color. It's got, as I said, a lovely orange-red fall color. Not really much more to mention about this particular tree here, except that as time goes by, it'll open up into a lovely open, round-headed tree. It's the vandals got to one side of this tree earlier this year, so it kind of destroyed the lovely symmetry to it. But as time goes by, it'll develop into quite a nice tree with a lovely informal profile. And on up to the Chamaecyparis at the top of the hill. We have here the false cypress, the Chamaecyparis, or Chamaecyparis as it's often called. It grows well in dry terrain, is related to the yellow cedar. Pretty well every tree that you see with this fine yellow foliage, whether it be an evergreen or a deciduous tree that has the yellow color to the foliage, will the yellow color will be much more pronounced in full sun. So if you're ever planting a tree or a shrub that has the yellow foliage, you're much better off to plant it in the full sun. And this one here is really doing well in this particular spot. It gets a bit of a winter burn off of the lake where the wind's blowing in, and there's some desiccation because of that, some drying out through the winter. But other than that, it's really doing quite well here, and it's set off well at the top of what we call Centennial Hill, again just off the tennis court. So if you're down, you'll know where to find it. It's a lovely tree. We've come here to one of the flowering crabs. Rick has done some basic summer pruning to reveal the crab apples have already formed here. These are, as you can see, an ornamental crab apple. They are edible, but they're so tiny that most people don't bother with them. They can be eaten, however. They're not poisonous. These trees are lovely in the spring. Many of the flowering crabs are a double pink flower, which means that there's twice as many petals as on a normal flower, which gives you the double flower, or a white flower, oftentimes a really solid, almost a red. It's that deep a pink, and those will fade to white. This particular variety of crab apple, we're not sure exactly what kind it is, but it comes out in that deep pink and slowly fades to a light pink. And the tree this year, it's not fruiting that heavily. I've seen it fruit much heavier than this. The crab apples are quite persistent on the tree. They hang on the branches right through until the spring, and you'll find the cedar waxwings coming through here in March, just devouring them. And I think at that time they've fermented a little bit on the vine, and the cedar waxwings have quite a good time with them. And they're commonly grown and recommended for wildlife and bird feed. Crab apple and most of the apples are quite easy to identify by their elliptical, slightly serrated edge to the leaf. The trees don't get that large. This tree has only been here for the last 15 years, and it had to go through some severe pruning because at one time we had a swimming pool here, and I think the lifeguards went nuts one year and took a good part of the tree away, but they don't get that large. They're an excellent tree for use in the home garden because of that, and their year-round interest. We can move from here across to the red cedar, and I think we can get a pretty good profile on the tree from this angle. It's the only native tree that we have here in the park. It's native to BC. As Fred was saying, it's one of the only trees, actually is the only tree with a droopy top. So you could identify it from quite a distance because of that. It's really covered this year with a lot of cones, and we didn't do core tests on this one, did we, Rick? But the one adjacent to it, we did take a core sample out, and the tree, I believe, came out at what age did we determine?
I think both that and the other trees we drilled were very close to being just over 60 years old. And I don't know if they were some of the original trees in the park, because I'm not sure how long the park has been here.
They may very well have been one of the original trees. The park, as close as we've been able to determine, has been used as a park. This particular site has been used as a park for the last 85 years. So there has been some planting going on here for quite a while, and we're really quite interested if there is anybody with historical information about the planting of these trees and the park, really any of the street trees in the area that could come forward and give us some background information. We'd really appreciate that. Can we approach the tree and get a good shot of the foliage?
If you look at this tree, you'll notice it's got very small cones, which makes it's one of our conifers with the smallest cones in western BC, and it's got a very fine, tight leaf. It doesn't look like an ordinary conifer leaf. It much resembles the ornamental cypress leaf in shape. And if you look at the bark, you'll notice that it's got very stringy bark, I guess would be the way to describe it. And the wood characteristics allow this tree to be used primarily for ornamental uses inside the house or for the shake and shingle industry. We're now standing next to the change house, and there's several large, bold trees right next to the change house, and these are known as silver maples, and they're characterized by having the leaves take off opposite from each other on the stem, as you can see right here, and then the leaf itself is deeply lobed, and it's the only maple to have a very deeply lobed leaf such as this. Okay, now if you flip the leaf over, you'll find that it's got quite a silver undersurface to it, like that, hence the name silver maple. And these are probably the largest bold trees in the park, and quite likely the oldest planted ornamentals, I should think. If you look over to the stem, you'll see that some of the stems here are about 2.5 feet through. And the third tree over there is also silver maple, and I believe it probably has close to a diameter of 4 to 5 feet.
Where can we find these, Fred? Where do they grow naturally?
These trees are found in eastern Canada, pretty much in southern Ontario and southern Quebec, and then through the northeastern United States. Okay, at Lakeside Park on the sandy beach, there's several willow trees planted, and these willow trees are known as weeping willow, and they're characterized by having long, droopy branches, and then the leaves are quite thin and long, perhaps about that wide and that long. Most home gardeners would be familiar with this tree as the tree that grows into their septic tanks, or if it's too close to the house, the one that grows into their drain tiles and plugs them up. If you look at the tree here, you can see its long, drooping branches. It's often planted as an ornamental throughout North America.
It's native to wet stream banks and really loves the water.
Yes. Right now we're just north of the change house, and we're standing in front of a Siberian elm. And the Siberian elm is a very fast-growing tree, often used for windbreaks or for hedges. It's got very brittle wood. And if you look closely at the leaves here, it's got the elm leaf habitat, which is a non-symmetrical leaf base and a slightly serrated leaf margin. It's being planted a lot now as an ornamental, and it may not be the most desirable ornamental to plant because of its vigorous root system. And fast growth, and it may grow up to a very tall tree in a short order when you may not want such a tall tree. This tree right here is only about 20 years old and is already 60 feet high. Okay, the tree I'm standing in front of now is a true fir, and which we often call a balsam, and it's characterized by having a flattened needle with a V-shaped tip, which is characteristic of all the true firs. This tree right here is the only tree that we haven't been able to positively identify, but what we suspect it is the balsam fir, which is native to eastern Canada. This tree is often used in the pulp and paper industry for pulp, and for lumber as well, for making 2x4s, 2x6s, and that sort of thing. It's very common in eastern Canada, and the boreal forests in northern Ontario and Quebec are composed of this particular species here.
And unlike the spruce, there's no way, because it's a flat-sided needle, there's no way it will roll between your fingers like the four-sided spruce needle.
And if you look at the end of the needle very closely, you'll see that it's got a V-shaped tip. It's kind of like that, right at the very top. Native to North America are two walnuts, the black walnut and the butternut. Right now we're north of the silver maple, standing in front of the two black walnuts in the park, and these trees are characterized by having a compound leaf, as we've already mentioned. This long piece here is the leaf, and these individual pieces here are leaflets. And this tree is probably the most important or the most valuable tree in North America for its hardwood. A tree such as this could be worth well over $10,000 for its wood alone. The wood is used for veneer, gun stocks, and valuable furniture. It's got a very, a lovely grain, and it's a the wood is can be creamy to dark brown in color. The nuts on the tree are opposite each other and are quite edible. And in the fall, if you've handled the husks surrounding the nuts, you'll find out that they've got a very powerful yellow dye and will stain your hands quite yellow. And this dye is often used for natural dyes for wool and cottons. And here's what an immature nut looks like right here. And there's also a husk surrounding it. Do you have anything to add on this? Here's a nut right here. It could be mentioned that the walnut trees are characterized by having, I guess, a chambered pith. And if you look closely here, you can see both the butternut and the black walnut have twigs which have chambered pith.
Now, if you have a walnut in your backyard or your front yard, what you might want to do, don't come down to the park and do this, because I don't think Eric would appreciate it, is cut a twig off of your walnut and split the twig in half, and you'll see what we call the chambered pith. And the butternut, if that's what you have, will have what we call a chocolate brown colored pith. Black walnut, on the other hand, will have what we call a buff colored pith. So if you're in doubt of what kind of walnut you have, you can open a twig and have a look at the color of the pith. Both will have chambered pith.
Also, the leaves on the black walnut are not hairy or pubescent, whereas the butternut leaves are quite pubescent. And right here we have a black walnut leaf, and you'll notice that the leaves are smooth or glabrous. And if you look at the butternut here, the compound leaf here is quite hairy, and that's another quick identifying character. Right now we're standing in front of the butternut tree, and if you look at the nuts on the butternut tree, you'll find out that they're in clusters of up to 5 nuts per cluster, as opposed to the black walnut, which just has 2 nuts per cluster. And as we've previously mentioned, the butternut has the rather hairy leaves. Yeah. And it's probably a more branching habitat. The black walnut grows up quite straight before it branches out, and the butternut tends to branch very close to the ground, perhaps only a meter, 3 or 4 feet off the ground, it'll branch out. If we go over to Rick now here, he's dissecting a butternut, and you'll be able to see that it's a smaller nut than the black walnut. He's also managing to dye his hands quite yellow in the process as well.
This is not the best time of year to collect these. You might want to wait, what, another month or 2?
Yes.
Eric?
Till the frost comes, the husks stay pretty, as you're discovering there. They stick to the nut itself pretty,
yeah,
pretty tenaciously.
I think once we get our fall rains, the outer husk will start to disintegrate. But what I'm attempting to do here is to show you the point on the top of the butternut itself, which is right here, as opposed to the black walnut nut, which is round, quite ovoid, but does not have this characteristic point. So those of you at home, again, who have some kind of walnut in your yard, if you want to look at your nuts, you can take a look and see if it's got the point or whether it's just round without the point, and that will distinguish your walnut from your butternut. And I don't know if you can see it, but as Fred says, my hands are going bright yellow with the whatever is in this.
And they'll stay that way for a couple days, won't they?
Probably, yeah. So I don't smoke, but that's what you get. It looks like a nicotine stain. Okay.
Right now we're standing in front of a horse chestnut tree, and this tree is native to Europe, and it's characterized by having what's called a palmately compound leaf. And if you look at this leaf, it's got 5 leaflets on a long petiole. And the other...
And it looks like a hand. So that's why we call it palmately compound.
And Rick in his hand here has one of the fruits of this tree, and it's a real spiny nut. And this is the same tree that's growing outside the courthouse in Nelson, and it's rather a messy tree in the fall with the nuts and leaves scattered all over the ground. Now this nut is not edible and is in fact toxic, so don't attempt to eat this particular nut. Butternut and black walnut are edible, but this one is not.
I'm sure a lot of you have seen these on the streets and cracked them open, and inside you see a bright brown nut with a buff colored little spot on it. in the United States and in Ohio, I'm sure those of you who watch football are familiar with the Ohio Buckeyes. Well, that name came from this seed, or this nut. And quite commonly, people who appear on the surface to be superstitious carry these nuts in their pockets because they believe it'll prevent rheumatism. Just a little local color to add to your knowledge of this particular species. Okay, we're standing close to one of the gates at the north end of the park, and we're here at what we call a ginkgo tree. And it is probably the oldest tree that has been discovered around the world. There are fossils around that have this very characteristic leaf shape that have been aged at over 20 million years. Now, this tree was believed to be extinct up until the late 1800s, until someone trudging through China discovered it in the courtyard of a Buddhist monastery. Now, this is a male tree. The male and female flowers are on different trees. But if you have a ginkgo in your backyard, and I think there's a few around Nelson, one that I know of, you can go outside and have a look, and if you've got a female tree, you will have bright yellow berries, and if you break them open, again, similar to the tree of heaven, you'll have a very unpleasant odor, and they'll usually in the fall they'll drop to the ground and sort of rot right there in place and have a very fetid stink to it, and you'll know that you've got a female ginkgo tree. This is a very nice shaped tree. It has very conical. It's a nice shade tree. Got anything that you want to add to this, Eric?
Well, as you may be able to see, the leaves are very fleshy, fan-shaped leaf, as Rick pointed out, and because the leaf is so fleshy, it's again a very pollution-tolerant tree, which is interesting that it is so tolerant to pollution, yet it's, as you were saying, 20 million years old. And here we have a tree which will do well in downtown Manhattan or Toronto, yet the tree itself has not changed from an evolution point of view for the last 20 million years. It's not a fast-growing tree, but the trick with getting these trees established is plenty of fertilizer and water right after they've been planted for the first few years, and that really seems to bring them along, and after that they pretty well seem to go on their own. If you come down to Lakeside Park, you'll notice that this individual here is being crowded out by the butternut right next door, and we're going to have to do a bit of pruning to release the ginkgo because we really don't want to risk moving it at this age. It has a lovely bright yellow color in the fall. It stands out like a sore thumb at this end of the park in the fall. Should be seeing that in the next few weeks or month.
Yeah, the only other thing I can add to that is this tree can grow to be quite tall. If you're not metricated, there are examples around the world apparently that grow to as tall as 120 feet. For those of you who are familiar with metric, that's about 34 meters tall. Okay. We're now over at what we call a paper birch. These are very characteristic leaves of birch, but you can confuse it with some other species such as alder. Suffice to say that it's got a serrated leaf margin. It branches opposite or alternate, and perhaps more characteristic is the bark of this tree. When you look at it from quite a distance, it'll appear very white. There'll be large, what we call lenticels, which are these horizontal marks across the bark. But this is a tree that the Indians of eastern North America and David Thompson, the famous explorer, used for their birch bark canoes. As to why it's called a paper birch, if you look at the way the bark peels off, it comes off in very thin sheets, very paper-like. And I think that, if anything, will give this tree away as being a paper birch. I don't think that there really is much use for it other than as an ornamental. It might be used for a bit of furniture work, but other than that, the wood isn't strong enough for dimension lumber. Don't think there's nothing else to bring up on that one. Now, if we move across to this oak, it's an English oak, and this is a very characteristically lobed leaf. They're rounded lobes, which makes this a member of the white oak family. Now, around town you might see some other oaks which have a pointed lobe. That's a member of the red oak family. But very characteristic of oaks, other than the leaf, is what we call an acorn. I'm sure most of you people know what an acorn is. And basically it's got a little leather-like cup with a nut held inside that. And this is an oak that has probably been used by the English for years, centuries, for boat building. It has in a natural state, it has a good straight stem, and as long as it's not damaged, and we can get quite good lumber out of this if it grows to sufficient size. The leaves will hang on to the stem through the winter in most cases and drop off the next year. I don't know how long you've had this in the park, Eric. It doesn't look that old.
Actually, this tree stayed at the cemetery for 8 years at the cemetery, did virtually nothing in the way of growth. We brought it down here, and this is a result of only 12 years growth here at the park. It came down here as a 2-inch caliper. That is, the trunk size was barely 2 inches when it was planted out here, and bang, away it went. And for a slow-growing tree like an oak, this is substantial growth. We suspect there's groundwater underneath here, and this tree has really, really grown. There's a tree outside the Heritage Inn on the boulevard on Vernon Street that is the same type of oak, and I learned the other day that the acorns for that tree came from Windsor Castle in England. And there are a number of other trees around the area which are about the same size, and we suspect that they're all the result of a bucket full of acorns that came over from Windsor Castle.
Okay. This tree here is a Norway maple, native to Norway and Northern Europe. It has a very characteristic leaf shape, not the one you see on the Canadian flag, but very close to it. And right next to that leaf, you can see the seeds, and they are usually in pairs, and they'll hang in a clump. And as a child, I used to take these and break these in half, and you could fly them, so to speak. But that's characteristic of all maples, and one way to identify different maples is to look to see what angle is formed by the two seeds and where they're joined. And this tree, I think, has some potential as a wood for furniture. It's used around urban areas for plantings because it is, again, an ash or a pollutant-tolerant species, widely planted throughout Nelson, and both Eric and I feel that there are maybe up to 3 different varieties around town.
Yep, at least 3 different varieties of the Norway maple.
Now, I've seen a purplish variety planted on some of the streets around Silica, up around Carbonate, and more of a reddish color more than a purple in some of the other areas. We haven't really keyed those out yet, so we're not too sure of the actual variety.
We do have the Crimson King, which is another variety of the Norway maple, and that's the common red variety tree that is commonly used as a specimen plant in front yards. One of the things that identifies the Norway maple is this soft white sap, which you get not unlike the same kind of sap that comes off of poinsettia when you break the branch. It's difficult to see here, but in the early spring you really get quite a white sappy the sap is quite white and sticky. It's you may be difficult to see with the close-up here, but you can still see a bit of a white sappy material coming out.
Yeah, we're looking now at one of the varieties of the Norway maple. As we mentioned earlier, it does have a red and a purple variety, and this one here is the reddish colored variety. It's the Crimson King, and it is planted in the park, and if you want to come down and have a look at it, it's right beside the monkey bars and the sandbox. And as we move across, we'll look at, again, a London plane tree, and it is right near the water fountain, and coming back across again will be the greenish colored variety of the Norway maple. And when you come down, make sure you have a look at the two different color types. We're now looking at what we call a London plane tree. This is characterized by primarily the globular shaped fruit that you can see hanging from the undersides of these branches. And also the leaf shape, which some people might confuse with a maple tree. But when we get up a little closer and we have a look at the leaf, you'll definitely see that we don't have the similar kind of venation, and that's another way we can look at it. But this tree also has a bark that is very characteristic, and if you look at the trunk of the tree, you'll see that the bark flakes off in very large chunks, and it does this annually. It's not like somebody's vandalizing it or anything, but as the tree grows and expands, it pushes out the bark, cracks it, and the bark sloughs off. And it'll grow a greenish colored bark early next spring, and it will toughen up and darken as we get into the summer and fall. This tree, for those people who study the classics, apparently this is a tree that Plato meditated under, and its Latin name, Plantanus, is the generic term. Perhaps we can speculate that Plotinus, Plato, who knows? I certainly don't. Now we'll move across here to the checkerboard in the park, and there's a good 7 trees on each, three and four on each side of the checkerboard, which are called columnar, very self-evident, white cedar. And I think I'm going to pass this to Eric. He probably knows a little more about these than I do.
These white cedar, as they're also called, are native to eastern Canada. They're widely used for hedging material, screens, for privacy, sun glare, headlight glare, noise glare. They're, when used in a double or a triple row, they're very effective for a noise barrier as well. They don't grow as fast as many people would like, but again, with plenty of water when they're young and some good fertilizer and in good soil, they'll do very well. They will perform much better in a well-lit, bright spot, and they will withstand some flooding in the spring, but if water stands around their roots for very long through the year, they will die. You'll see tip die back around the top of the tree and around the perimeter of the tree, and this will indicate that there is too much water standing around. Not always a problem around here, but something to consider when you're choosing the plant for a particular site. There are many different varieties, name varieties of this plant, and some of them have a lovely, more than a columnar shape, a pyramidal shape. There's been varieties out of Denmark in particular in the last few years that also have a lovely texture as well as a pyramidal shape. And when used in groups of 3 or 5 or 7, generally odd-numbered groups, they can also be used in group plantings like that. Otherwise, they would not normally be used as a specimen planting. One tree alone planted out on its own generally looks a little odd, so it's best to use these in groups of 3 or 5, or as I was saying earlier, as a screen or a hedge plant.
We're here now at the Manitoba maple, which is just west of the checkerboard. And this is a maple. If you look carefully, there is the opposite branching, but it is the only maple that does not have a characteristic maple leaf-shaped leaf. And the other thing that is characteristic of the maple are the seeds, which again you can see here are in pairs. But again, to help identify this, we look at the angle that these seeds grow at in pairs. The other thing that we've just noticed is if you come into the park, don't get confused by the different colored leaves, because on this same tree we've got a variegated leaf color and a plain type leaf color. And this is primarily planted as an ornamental in the park and around the city. I think I've seen 2 or 3 other specimens in the city. And it's probably commonly planted throughout the prairies as an ornamental around the parks and the city streets. It's probably, for that reason, it's used because it's probably pollution resistant, can survive high levels of ash and fallout from industrial areas. I don't think the wood is all of that valuable for furniture or dimension lumber purposes, but it does give sort of a diffuse type of a shade. If you wanted something for your backyard, this probably wouldn't be too bad of a choice.
It would be an excellent choice, not just because it's very hardy, but this variegation gives the landscape a lovely change in not only texture, as Rick pointed out, but having a bit of white or yellow in the landscape is really a pleasant contrast. You've got to be careful if and when you buy a tree like this that you don't end up pruning out all the variegated branches, because you'll find that some of the branches have variegated leaves and some of them have the common leaves. And the best bet is, if you plan on doing some pruning, is to either do it at this time of the year when you can see what type of leaf there is on each branch, or else tag them with a thin piece of surveyor's tape or something, and then prune them later in the year, so that you prune out the solid green, or if you wish, prune out the variegated if that's what you prefer.
Here is a Russian olive. I think it's native to the Balkans and the drier countries in the Mideast. If you look at the leaves when you come down, they are a very blade-shaped lanceolate type leaf. They're grayish in color because they got some very fine hairs all over it. And on the twigs themselves, you'll notice that these long twigs here these are the petioles from last year. In other words, this long succulent green piece here that the leaves are attached to, the leaves fall off and that's what's left, and it will stay on for a year or two. Another interesting feature of this particular tree is there are spines on the twigs, and there's one right there that gives it some form that we use to identify this particular species. Another interesting feature is when you look at the bark, it's very stringy, much like the western red cedar, but very effective, kind of a nice texture, nice to look at.
On the east side of the playground area is a Colorado blue spruce, and if you look at this tree, you'll see it's characterized by a very bluish-green foliage. And this tree is native to the Rocky Mountains of the central United States, Colorado. And it's a very popular ornamental throughout North America, particularly because of its very green foliage. It grows, it's a moderately fast-growing tree. I should imagine that this tree is maybe about 50 years old, and it's quite tall at this point. It's a very compact tree, so it doesn't take up a lot of space in a garden. And if you handle the twigs on this tree, you'll notice that they've got very prickly leaves, and you can tell right away that it is a spruce by its leaves which roll in your hand, and its very prickly needles. If you're a spruce tree owner and you've noticed that the ends of some of the buds on your spruce tree have this brown or a dead leaf growth at the end of it, it's from the spruce gall aphid, and this particular aphid is native to North America and will attack all spruces. It's nothing to be too terribly concerned about because it only affects the lateral buds, so the tree will still grow up, but you'll have this dead growth at the end of a number of your twigs. And on this twig here, you can see several of the sites where the spruce gall aphid has taken hold, and it will kill the lateral bud and promote more branching. So it'll make the tree more branchy than it otherwise would normally be.
This is the Mayday tree, commonly grown in many home gardens and unfortunately along many street trees as well. I say unfortunately because it is a very fast-growing tree. In fact, by many considered to be a weed species because it's so fast-growing. Consequently, same with the silver maples. These trees grow very quickly, and their branch structure is not that strong, and they're susceptible to wind and ice damage in the wintertime. So you wouldn't want to plant a tree like this too close to your home for fear of at some point in the future part of it coming down your house. At this time of the year, you'll notice the small black berries, which again are persistent through the wintertime and produce some fruit for the winter feed for the birds, which is a good thing. The flowers are rather nondescript. Of course, they're not on the tree at this time, but you get a very light speckling of small white flowers on the tree, and a nice green elliptical leaf, but again not exactly the best choice for planting in front of a house. It's really, except for the winter feed that the berries give, not a really great tree. It could be used, I suppose, for a wind screen because it grows so quickly. You could plant them fairly close together, and because they grow so fast, you can usually get a hold of them for a fairly good price. We are standing right now between the greenhouses and the picnic shelter, and just behind me here is the mountain ash. Everyone's familiar with, or most people are familiar with the mountain ash by their very characteristic orange and red berries. It's called the European mountain ash, originates in Europe, is native to Europe, is a really lovely tree, not just for the red berries, which last right through till February, March, when again the cedar waxwings come in and have a lovely feast on their way through, and it has a white, very powdery, almost smoky white flower in the springtime, which is quite fragrant, and some people really enjoy the super sweet fragrance, and other people find it to be a little much, but nonetheless the flower itself is a lovely sight from a distance. It's not a difficult tree to grow. It does get some of the rust that other members of the apple family get, but is generally without problems. It grows fast and is established quite easily, and you'll find if there's a mountain ash in your neighborhood, oftentimes there will be young volunteers coming up in the flower beds around the area. It's as I said, an excellent tree to plant for winter feed for the birds.
Yeah, just for a few minutes here, I thought we'd take a look at some of the references we've had to use to identify a lot of the trees in Lakeside Park. And I think the other thing I'll give you an idea is relative expense, because anybody who wants to buy a reference book is interested in how much it's going to cost. I think, first of all, this is a Canadian publication. It's called Native Trees of Canada. It's by Hosey. It's available from most bookstores for about $10. It's a good general text. It's got a description of where the tree is found, what characteristics to look for, and it also has some pictures which will help you identify it. At the back and the front of the book will also be some keys that you can flip through to identify yourself, either through summer characteristics or winter characteristics. So not a bad book to use for your own use. Next, the Audubon Society has several publications out for natural history. This is one of them. They produce two of these, Native Trees of North America, or Trees of North America. This is for the western region. A little more expensive than Native Trees of Canada. It's about $16. Can be got at most of the bookstores in town. Again, it has photographs, but this breaks it down into stems, leaves, flowers. And after you get through the photographs, there's a written description of where the tree grows naturally, how to identify it, and the characteristics to look for. A little more expensive, but it's a good one to have if you're interested in identifying trees. This one's just recently on the market, Trees of North America and Europe by Roger Phillips. It's about $16. It's, again, it's got photographs in there, color photos, good for identifying leaves. It gets into different leaf shapes. It gets into the fruits, and there are descriptions along with the photographs. The descriptions are rather brief, but the photographs are well worth the purchase if that's what you use extensively to identify your species with. This last book I have here, Illustrated Book of Trees, is a little more technical and a little more expensive. It's about $26 to $28. It's by William Grimm. He's a naturalist who's also taught at university, but it has a lot of keys in it. If you cannot find a picture in any of the other ones that matches what you've got, this gives you a basic breakdown of leaf shapes, the characteristic descriptions of the leaves. When somebody talks about a doubly serrate leaf, this will tell you what he means by that. It talks about the flowers, the different kinds of flowers, and then when you've got the basics down, it will go into keys and how to use a key. And then for each of the major families, like the pine family, it will give you a key to break down the pines to their different genera, and then go through to the different species. And in the descriptions will be a picture generally of the foliage and the fruiting bodies with a description of where the tree came from and what to look for in the characteristics. A good book if you're into keying things out and has a lot of technical information in it. Now, if you have some individual species in your backyard or something on the boulevard that you're interested in and you don't know what it is, there's several sources around town. Primarily, we have a number of foresters at the Ministry of Forest Regional Office at 518 Lake Street. You can call down that number. It's 354-4181, and ask for either Fred Thiessen or myself as Rick Baker. And if we can't identify it, we'll certainly find a source. We've got other references we can pull. And I would also like to direct you towards Eric Lees, the city gardener. And if you have any queries about anything in the park here, whether it be the trees, the shrubs, and maybe even more specific, your interest might be lie on the flower beds, because I'm sure Eric could be more than willing to give you some idea of what he's got growing in here, when you might want to plant it, if you've got some ideas on what colors you might want to have in your garden. By all means, don't hesitate to ask. We have some thoughts on future self-guided tours around the city, and I think it will depend in a large part on the response we get from the public on what we've done in the park here. The City Tourist Park on High Street has a lot of natural native species. We thought that would be another nice area to look at putting a tour together. Another area that we think might be of interest is to combine a natural heritage walk with the City Heritage Walk, look around the core of the city of Nelson, showing not just the buildings that are cultural heritage to the city, but also the native tree species and the ornamentals and exotic species that have been brought into the city to enhance the environment. And I think we hope you've enjoyed the tour, and if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We've enjoyed it, and I hope you will too.